presented. So a couple of questions, Ayad. I mean, you talked, I loved your introduction to the book and how you see the characters and the characters of the two women. The mother, we heard from, in her voice in the excerpt, and then obviously Minna, auntie, right? They are very important to women. They seem to be really drawn, yes, indeed, with a lot of affection and respect and so on. But and this was what I'm curious about, is that in the character of Minna especially, the mother, why does she put up, for example, with the father's constant betrayals, marital betrayals, and how, what is that perception of a woman who in other ways seems very strong, and is also cursing out the husband in front of the son, but clearly stays with the husband. And in the other woman's case, Minna, who has this, as you said, many contradictions, we're all full of them, but she ends up, in the end, despite falling in love with the Jewish character played by Nathan, ends up, partly because of, right, it's tragic. And she does, and so despite the fact that she is one of your dervish characters, right, she's a Sufi, she has a very tolerant interpretation of Islam that she's trying to teach the young and impressionable, Hayat, she ends up in some ways being quite intolerant, also very, in some ways, she distances herself from the Jewish guy and ends up in a very horrible relationship with a man who abuses her, in a way repeating her earlier history, marital history, and ends up dying of a very painful cancer. So I'm not quite sure what to make of the way that these women characters actually fundamentally come across to us as readers.
And you're not sure what to make of it because I'm not sure what to make of it. I mean, the reality is that the central question of my childhood was being surrounded by all of these brilliant women who were suffering internally and who didn't seem to be able to change their condition, and who paradoxically seemed to be teaching all of their sons the same behaviors that were causing them so much difficulty. And that whole quandary, that whole dilemma of the feminine situation, which I think exists in a theological way within the Abrahamic faiths in general, but certainly within Islam, seemed to me a very rich vein to explore. I don't subscribe to the idea that art is a public relations issue. I'm not, my job as an artist isn't to make people look good. It isn't to make Muslims human. It's interesting, there's a W.E.B. Du Bois, I don't know, you guys, some of you may know who, great American theorist of African-American consciousness, talks about this idea, he calls double consciousness. He says that a minority culture, a minority identity will see itself through the eyes of the majority. Right? And so this is a double consciousness. You have your own experience and you have the experience that you think the dominant majority is having of you. Right? I don't have double consciousness. I don't know why. I should, but I don't. So my experience is primary. It's my experience. I don't care what white folk think about my experience, to be crass. I never have. I'm just writing what feels real and true to my experience as an American, as a Muslim. My book, all of my work, is about American life. It just happens to be from the Muslim point of view, in ways that writers who I admire, like Philip Roth or Woody Allen, Larry David and Seinfeld, are writing about American life from a distinctly Jewish point of view. That's my response. I don't know if I can.
It's interesting to think about how you describe the women characters who seem to have a lot of personal agency, right? They're able to express their rage and their anger. Just the sort of non-stop berating the high witnesses his mother sort of hurling at her husband. I mean, it's comical and sad at the same time, but they also don't have that larger cultural agency. So it seems as if, even as a writer, that even though you don't think of yourself as having double consciousness, your characters seem to represent a double consciousness. That was written by someone with this idea, because we want to see this idea of...
Who's we, though? Who's we?
The reader.
The reader being somebody who's not from that experience.
Right.
So that's that's your interpretation of double consciousness.
Well, one of the questions I actually wanted to ask you is how it feels to have your work, where you said that you're not interested in public relations. At the same time, and I'll get back to the other question in a moment, how does it feel to have your work out there where you can't sit and say, I'm not being a PR agent for Muslim culture, because that's kind of the way that it has to be perceived in many instances because of the cultural moment that we're in.
Right, but I agree. I think that's a worthy question, and I think it's an important one. I think it's not my preoccupation, and the work is only going to suffer from an orientation that is not about the work or about finding something that's true, but by orienting toward a majority culture in a finite moment that will change. So if I'm not interested in the quiddity of something, that is to say the beingness, the essence of something, that is to say, let's say Muslim American life in a Pakistani American household in the early 80s, right? If I'm not interested in the truth of that, without the intervening filters of how folks are going to interpret my work, then I'm compromising my own artistic project. Art for me is not advertising. It's very difficult for people to understand that today.
But I wonder if there's some middle ground, right? So it's art, not advertising.
So let me finish I'm going to answer your question. There isn't for me. There isn't for me. I think there might be for folks who read it, and there might have legitimate criticisms of the work that I do, and that's their prerogative. And that's the chance that I have to take. Disgraced was up at Lincoln Center in the fall of 2012, and Disgraced makes American Dervish look like a Neil Simon, in the sense that it's scathing. It's a scathing play, and unforgiving in some ways. And there was a fellow who runs one of these big theater institutes who initiated an email exchange with me about some administrative thing, and we started just emailing back and forth, and he eventually divulged to me that he was with a Pakistani person in his life who was his partner, and that he had taken all of his in-laws to go see Disgraced in the fall of 2012, right? 12 of them, a dozen, he took a dozen of them to go see the play. And he said they absolutely abhorred it. They hated it with a passion. I'm not done. You guys are hankering over there. I'm a storyteller.
Right, got it.
8 months later is when we're having our email exchange. And he's telling me, it's interesting because I'll be over at the house and arguments will still break out from time to time about Disgraced. And what's been interesting to observe is that half of the people have completely changed their opinion and now think that the work is a profound comment on their experience as Muslims in America. The capacity for work to have that kind of timeline within audiences or a viewer's attention, staying power to mature, elasticity, is something that is not served at all by me thinking about what other people are going to think about what I'm doing.
No, that totally makes sense, but I think for us trying to sort of plumb the depths, right, of what it is that makes your work both enjoyable and interesting, but also provocative, and in some of the examples that you yourself have cited, clearly pushing buttons that you have to be aware of as a writer, that they are going to push buttons. So I'm sort of interested in pursuing that a little bit. I mean, I know you had, we can get back to your question.
I think that's the question that I was getting to, or trying to get to. So, if there's one thing not to be interested, which is what you're saying, right? I'm not interested in what buttons might get pushed.
I
right?
don't
I'm not
have the
not-
dominant majority. I don't know the dominant
Right,
majority buttons.
but you're not going to make a decision in any of your work and say, well, I'm not going to depict this character in this way because it might piss off, offend, provoke. You're not going to make that turn because you're not writing didactic art. Your art is not meant to be didactic.
Right.
But I wonder at what level you know that it might do that and then decide that you don't care. 'Cause that's the doubleness. that I'm
And
thinking
can I
about.
just add on to
That makes
this?
but that's
That does make sense, and I have a
Yeah.
response to it, but it
And
sounds like
actually,
she wants
I
to
just
have
wanted to
a
add on to that, just so that you don't have to answer two very similar, perhaps, although from a different perspective. You said that, you don't have a take on the majority, or that's not, however you're defining,
Majority
right?
consciousness.
Right, majority consciousness, but is that majority consciousness across all races, ethnicities, backgrounds, religions in America, or is it a specific group? Because obviously, from also one of the examples you just cited, you're pushing buttons that are going to, and I found that particularly true in Disgraced, that are both going to, make people say, wow, I get that, and I relate to that, even though that may not be something that I'm going to speak about,
Right.
and or say, within the Pakistani American community, particularly, or the Muslim community in general, okay, that's really, I find that very problematic. Maybe not offensive is too strong a word, I don't like that word, but problematic. And I want to cite just one example. So, for example, in your book, you have a chapter called Portrait of an Anti-Semite as a young man, right, or a young
Right.
boy. And clearly, there are these kinds of Jewish-Muslim situations that you are mining, and I think very important work. I actually personally think that this is extremely important because it hasn't been done quite that way in anything that I've read before, and that may be part of what draws people from both extremes to your work. But I do wonder what you would say, and I know Disgrace takes up some of that, those issues, but in a moment where I think a lot of people from Muslim background might feel that the anti-Semitic becomes a kind of use of a term to shut down debate perhaps on policies that Muslim communities might be against, which have to do with the state of Israel, and not really because they're against Jewish people.
Right.
So
that's a long, complicated. I think American Dervish goes into that with much greater eloquence than I could sit here and go into it. I mean, the Quran. We could see the Quran as many different things. One thing that we must see it as also is a secondary source commenting on the Old Testament. We must see Islam as a reaction and renewal of a Judaic tradition. So the ways in which Judaism actually is the wellspring of Islamic consciousness is just a fact. There's no debate in that. Unfortunately, within the Muslim community, that is not something that people want to talk about. They don't even want to admit it into consciousness. And so the borrowings, the Jewish borrowings, the continuities of sensibility, the continuities of mythos and practice, ontology, cosmogony, those are just central parts of Muslim identity. And for any writer who's seeking, in a real sense, to contribute to the American tradition, literary tradition, from a Muslim point of view, it requires a cognizance, just as understanding that Melville and Faulkner and Jonathan Edwards and Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson and Toni Morrison are all quoting the Old Testament. A Muslim American writer must make recourse to the Quran. But for an American audience that doesn't know anything about the Quran, there's also a job of introducing that material. Getting to the point that, Patricia, you were suggesting. I find that when I wrote American Dervish, did not expect anyone to read it. I had written a book that took me 7 years to write, that I thought was the great magnum opus, the greatest work since Moby Dick, in the ranks. And I showed it to my best friend who was a writer at graduate school, and a very talented guy who was trying to write his novel. He pulled me aside one day and he said, you know, maybe you don't want to show this to anyone else. You needed some work. So I thought, he's just jealous. He's trying to finish his book. I finished a book. I've written a great book. He doesn't know it. Showed it to other friends. People didn't call me back. I thought it was going to kill me. It's my 26 to 31. Those crucial years when the mind is discovering the world and language. And it didn't kill me. But I did not write the second novel expecting that it was going to be any better. I really was not thinking about what other people are going to think about my book.
I'm happy with that answer because sometimes when I'm teaching a text, right, our students sort of long for the author to come and say, tell us what you want us to think. So to have an author admit that he's not even thinking about us, actually I think it...
But I am thinking about something else. What I am thinking about, I'm 43, and I've been through a lot. I've been through a lot. In the business, show business, it's a rough business. We can talk about that. Things are looking good now, right? You have a room full of people. It's not always like this. And one of the things that I've learned over the many failures, was that recent book by Sarah Lewis called Arise about the importance of failure to creative success. So true, so true. You know what? Don't be afraid to do what you want to do because you're going to fail. Get out there, fail hard, fail good, fail now. The sooner you get your failures under your belt, the sooner you're actually going to be successful. You will not be successful, I pray, I hope that you will not be successful your first time out, because you'll just screw it up. Get out there and fail. Anyway, I failed a lot. And one of the attainments of my failures was a much simpler sense of what it means to be a human person. Much simpler. Not interested in the status of being an author or the status of this or that, but connected to others in a simple way. As a narrative artist, there's a real simple barometer for that. When an audience starts to sense that there is a story being told, well, it's okay. When an audience senses that a story is being told, they wake up. Some part of us wakes up. It's like the child part of us. It's that simpler part of us. I write to that in myself because I know if I'm writing to that in myself, I'm writing to that in everybody in the audience. Because it's the one thing we all share.
And we're going to, I think, move on to the film, but one of the things I really loved, and I did love the novel, was that moment when Hayat, it's early in the novel when he's in class and the professor begins to talk about the Quran. And so he looks at the three Muslim students, and I thought they were kind of archetypes in a certain way, right? You have the purist who storms out and the follower who storms out, and then Hayat stays, and he sort of seems assimilated, and he's rewarded for that. And I thought, you don't want to flatten everybody out and say we're all alike, but I think anybody who has existed on the margins, right, anyone who sees themselves or is seen as other, has those moments where they can try to fit in or click or hold on to something that they think is really close to them. So I think that you actually do in that way sort of achieve the humanity element of it.
I want to address the question of double consciousness, and then you can go to the movie, but I just want to, there's one example I want to give. For those of you who have read the book, and those of you who don't know the book, at the centerpiece of the book is a anti-Semitic sermon given in a mosque that is kind of this centerpiece of the book. Nathan, who's a character we've fallen in love with in a way, even though he's a bit of a schlemiel, and he is with Nina and they're going to get married. It looks like they're going to get married, and he comes to the mosque exploring the possibility of perhaps converting, you know, if in deference, as many non-Muslim men do when they fall in love with Muslim women. So he explores this and ends up at a sermon where it's really just anti-Semitic sermon. Now, what's interesting is that one of the pitfalls of being a Muslim American writer is that the sermon that that imam gives is actually theologically very nuanced. It turns out to have political valences that are deeply abhorrent. A non-Muslim viewer only sees that and says, oh, see that bad imam? When there is a richness of characterization to that imam, moments of tenderness, presence, a nuance that is not available to a reader who is looking for a stereotype. That stereotype is not in the book. That's coming from the reader. That is also something I can do nothing about. I cannot create a work that is going to a priori go into the mind of the reader and somehow short-circuit that part of the brain that is looking for a pattern that it has come to recognize as true from the news, and to think that I'm going to actually be able to tell a story. So I have to just give it up to God and say, you know what? Hopefully the book is worthy enough, entertaining enough, and deep and layered enough for people to keep reading it. And it's interesting, a lot of Christian readers ask me the question, they're like, you know what? I really didn't like that imam, but I gotta say there were some things he was saying about love in that sermon that seemed like they were true. Is that in my imagination? I said, no, it's not. And they said, well, you know, my dad's a pastor, so I